Researcher. Good. Glad you make it. Alright. Now, you said that you wanted to do some world building for a fantasy setting, and you'd said you'd wanted research material for medieval European feudalism, as I recall. Still, that's what you... Okay, good. Got the right books. There's a lot to go over. Feudalism is a very, very broad subject, as you can probably tell. So for the sake of time, we're going to stick to just the bare bones basics, and then I'll give you some reading material that you can use on your own afterwards. Does that sound good? All right. A good question to ask yourself at the start, of course, is, what am I researching? What is feudalism? I don't know. And neither does anybody else. Feudalism is a bit of a catch-all term. There wasn't really an archetypal feudal society. There were a bunch of things that a bunch of different kingdoms had in common back then, but nothing was completely universal. You can usually find an exception, or 10. So take everything that we're about to cover with a whole bag of salt, because it's probably wrong at least once. So, I have some stuff that would be a lot easier if I had a blackboard to show it on. Hold on a second.
Ah, okay. Much better. So here's our definition of feudalism. Or at least kind of feudalism. Point 1. It's built on a loyalty pledge, or a fealty pledge if you want to sound fancy. 2. It has a class system. And 3. There's a big cheese at the top. This is probably your king, or your queen, but it could also be a council of nobility, it could be a bunch of mages that took over, it could even be a duly elected republic. There's really no rule on who's at the top. The only catch is that there has to be someone at the top, or someones at the top. There is an ultimate capstone on this pyramid, so to speak. Let's take these points one at a time and do a little bit of fleshing out so you have an idea of what each of them means. When we say that feudalism is built on loyalty pledges, this is the bedrock of feudalism. The king pledges to his lords that he'll give them land and he'll let them rule it. He's pledged to support them when they're attacked. The lords in turn pledge to the king that they'll support him if he gets attacked. They'll pay him some taxes from time to time. And there's a bunch of these loyalty pledges going all the way up and down the system. Point number 2 comes out of point number 1. The classes are really just which group of people pledges loyalty to which group of other people, and what are they pledging between each other. Point 3 is really just a continuation of point 2. You've got one person who's sitting at the top of this giant chain of loyalty pledges. That's your king, or your council, whatever the case may be.
Alright, clear as mud? Good.
Okay, so we start with our king at the top. He has obligations to the lords below him. The king has one really important obligation to the lords below him, and that's military support. If one of his lords gets attacked by another lord, the king has to come in and help him. If two lords are fighting, the king needs to settle disputes between them. And that's not just an obligation, that's also going to help him keep his kingdom from falling apart. Outside of this military support, you've also got things like granting land. The lords are going to be able to levy taxes on the land that they own, which is going to help make them wealthy. And then they'll pay a small share of that up to the king, who technically owns the land that they are owning. The lords are going to pledge loyalty to the king. The lords also have a loyalty pledge towards the knights, and even to the serfs on their land. For the king, the lords have promised military support. If the king calls on the lords to go to war, they go to war. As for their knights, the lords have a very similar obligation to the knights as the king does to the lords. If a knight gets into trouble, the lord has to deal with it. If the knight is in the wrong, the lord might not actually come save him, but it is certainly the lord's problem. For serfs, the lord has an obligation to protect them. The serfs aren't expected to fight for the lord. They might, and the lord could certainly call on them in a desperate time, but this isn't really mutual. A lord is going to protect his serfs by calling them into his castle or other fortified location when the area gets attacked, when his lands are attacked. Knights are going to serve lords like lords serve kings. They may or may not be landed. there could be unlanded knights who just serve in a lord's household, or even another rich knight's household. The big difference between a knight and a lord is actually mostly semantics. A lord is whoever the king says is a lord. The barons are whoever the king says are barons. Same goes for counts, for viscounts, for any noble rank you want to give. The king can just hand out titles to whomever he wishes. Normally, the difference between a knight and a lord is going to be how many men the person controls, and how much land he has, and how much money he has, but that's not always the case. You could, in theory, have a knight who's just way wealthier than any lord. Serfs are basically just one step up from slaves, actually. They technically have rights, but they don't have a lot of them. They have a right to worship whatever the Lord says they can worship, and they have a right to change their homes and go to somewhere else, if the Lord says that they're allowed to change homes and go somewhere else. They're allowed to get married. Theoretically, the Lord would have to approve that too. They're definitely allowed to eat. They're allowed that one. The step up from a serf is a yeoman. They have some rights. A yeoman might actually own a small amount of land on his own, and he might be allowed to hunt. Restricted, he probably won't be able to hunt just anything he wants, but he can hunt without permission. Probably. Now you can see our little top-down pyramid here. We've got two groups, really. Those who fight, your king, your lords, and your knights, and we've got those who work, your serfs and your yeomen. There is a third group, those who pray. That's our church over here. The church is a separate entity, almost entirely. A key aspect of medieval Europe is tension between the church and the nobility. The church is, in some ways, subject to the nobility. The nobles can certainly make demands of them, and the church won't be able to actually stop anything, because they don't have an army. But the church is going to claim a lot of privileges, and most nobles are going to give them those privileges. They're not going to pay taxes. They are going to be able to own land without the Lord saying no. In point of fact, churches can levy taxes on that land and just take all of it for themselves. Nothing goes to the Lord, nothing goes to the knights, and nothing goes to the king. Churches even have their own court system that the kings and the lords can't interfere with. These are all things that the nobles could practically step in on, but they almost always don't. Until they do, there was a lot of tension going on. The idea is that the church will stand apart with its own internal hierarchy, serving the goals of mankind. Nobles, serfs, yeomen, it doesn't matter, you're all equal here. Realistically, if the local church's priest or bishop is being appointed by a lord or a king, he's going to be more loyal to the king than he is going to be to any other church member. So you could absolutely turn churches into a political tool, and it happened quite a bit. Alright, now that you have a rough and ready understanding of what historical feudalism looked like, you're ready to ask yourself some questions about how to use it for your world building. The most important thing you're going to want to keep in mind is that you aren't building a country. You're building a kingdom. There aren't really strict geographical borders until recently. That's a modern idea. In a feudal world, you're going to control the land that your army can protect. You remember all those loyalty pledges? This is the end result of that. In a feudal world, you really only control the land that your army can protect. If your castles and villages are completely surrounded by other castles and villages from enemy lords, your kingdom is going to stop looking like a kingdom, and it's going to start looking like an archipelago. When it comes to building your kingdom, you're going to have some questions you need to ask. Looking at the top down, you'll probably want to start by asking whether you have a king. Is this a king in charge? Or maybe it's a queen in charge? Maybe you've got a council of nobles? You're going to need to find someone who's going to be your highest person, or some group that's going to be your highest people. These are the ones that have the ultimate power and authority. The king could be the king for a lot of reasons. Maybe it's just the biggest guy on the block. Or maybe the government was divinely chosen by a god in the setting. Or maybe the king was selected by prophecy. Who knows? It's entirely up to you. Once you've got your highest rank, though, you need to move on to your lords. You don't actually have to call them lords. obviously, but you do need to figure out who's going to answer directly to the king. Are these lords like historic lords? Do they have a military obligation if the king calls for war? Are they responsible for just overseeing the peasants where they rule? Maybe they have religious obligations. Last, you're going to have to figure out how your peasant class works. Do you have yeomen? Are peasants ever allowed to own land? Are all peasants allowed to own land? Are serfs stuck on the land? Do they need the lord's permission to do literally anything? Do they have to pay taxes in produce like a historical serf would, or do they just sort of exist? The big important part with serfs is you're really going to need to know their rights. Can they leave? Can they marry? Are they allowed to educate themselves? Can they educate others? Are they allowed to worship? Is there religion that they have to follow? Are they allowed to earn money? That sort of thing. The last thing you'll want to do is figure out how religion fits in. If you've got a monotheistic religion in your setting, you could probably copy certain parts of history directly. But if you've got a pantheon, you'll want to put a little more thought into that. Are temples privileged? Are they part of a serf class, a lord class? Are they their own class? Can they own property? Can they interfere in politics? Are they banned from politics? Are all of the gods welcome in your pantheon, or just a selection? And which ones are allowed? Who picks that? Do the lords pick? Does the king pick? I'll be talking about how to craft pantheons and religions in a later research guide. So if you're interested in hearing about that, make sure to subscribe. Once you've figured out all of your classes, you're going to want to make sure that you have a firm idea of how power and property move. What do I mean by that? Well, when a king dies, all of his political power and his property usually goes to his oldest son. But you might want a different way of doing that. Maybe it goes to his wife, or his eldest daughter, or maybe it goes to whichever son wins a jousting tournament. You'll also want to make sure that you know what happens when there isn't an heir to the throne. You'll also want to make sure that you cover the same idea for a lord and his successor, and just a serf. If a serf is allowed to own property, who gets it when he dies? His family? The lord? What happens if there's nobody at all? When it comes to transferring power and property, the law is important, so you'll also want to have a rough idea of who made the law, who gets to carry out the law, and lastly, who has the final word on the law. Once you can pin these down, you've got a much better grasp on how power dynamics work in your world, and you're ready to start creating an actual story in it.
Okay, so that's the short version of feudalism. If you're looking for something more in depth, you could probably start by reading Chris Wickham's Medieval Europe. It's short-ish, it's pretty entertaining, very detailed, very informative, and if you're willing to buy it used, you can probably find it for less than $10. But I'll leave a link in the description if you want to just grab it quickly off of Amazon. If you want a primary source, I would recommend the Alexiad by Emma Komnene. It's written from the perspective of the daughter of one of the emperors of the Byzantine Empire. She wrote it as a history of what her father accomplished during his reign. It's a very good piece if you're looking for, let's say, an insider take on what a king would look like, or how a king's court might function in a medieval society. There's a very good translation of it that I'll link in the description. If you're looking for something more fictional, the Cadfael stories are set in medieval England and feature a Benedictine monk solving mysteries. They're a lot of fun. I would also highly recommend Mount & Blade Warband. Yes, the video game. It isn't great simulation of medieval life, but it will give you an appreciation for the cost of warfare, for the lack of borders in a medieval kingdom, and for just how important loyalty pledges could be between kings, lords, and knights. At any rate, I hope you found this research guide useful. Best of luck, researcher. I'll see you next time.